Good evening, good morning, and welcome to this special webinar about a musical event that rocked China's musical landscape exactly 50 years ago. I welcome all of you in the audience, and my name is Madeline Ross. I work at the U.S.-China Education Trust in Washington, D.C. And I hope many of you in the audience took advantage of the opportunity to watch the documentary film Beethoven in Beijing, which USET, which is U.S.-China Education Trust, is making available through this Friday night. If you're interested in this history of the Philadelphia Orchestra's visit to China, the documentary will bring the history to life. It has amazing footage and details, so I recommend that to you. I'd like to, speaking of watch the film, give a special shout out to the Princeton alumni group that's watching the film together tonight in Washington, D.C., socializing, and now joining us all together for this webinar. It's a great idea, and we're glad to have you. So, we have a very special opening this evening. There is someone in our audience tonight who was not only at the concerts in Beijing and Shanghai in September 1973, but he actually did more than any other single person probably to bring that event to life and make it a success. So, without further ado, I would like to ask my colleague, Ambassador Julia Chang Block, who is the founder and executive chair of the U.S.-China Education Trust, to introduce this special person to us. Go ahead, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline. Good evening and good morning. As we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Philadelphia Orchestra's historic 1973 visit to Beijing, which launched music diplomacy as an integral part of the normalization of relations between the U.S. and China, USET, the U.S.-China Education Trust, is very proud, as Madeline has just said, to salute Ambassador Nicholas Platt, a distinguished diplomat and the longtime chair of USET's Advisory Council. I've known Nick for a very long time, and he is one of the wisest and most experienced China watchers in America. Having spent 34 years in the Foreign Service, starting in Hong Kong, he accompanied President Nixon to China in 1972 and helped establish the U.S. Liaison Office in Beijing in 1973. He served as ambassador to Pakistan, the Philippines, and Zambia, taking the helm of the Asia Society for 12 years before becoming President Emeritus in 2004 when he joined USET. Nick was a young Foreign Service officer serving at the U.S. Liaison Office in Beijing when he was asked to take on the management of the Philadelphia Orchestra tour for the embassy. Nick negotiated arrangements for the visit, and both he and his wife, Sheila, were assigned to accompany the orchestra on its 10-day visit. In effect, they had a front row seat for the entire tour. Eugene Ormandy, the orchestra's conductor, was not a fan of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony and initially refused when Madame Mao demanded the orchestra play it. Nick Platt saved the day. He explained the symphony's significance to the Chinese. He told Ormandy, the Chinese love the symphony's pastoral themes, signifying for them the struggles and triumphs of their peasant revolution. Ormandy conceded. The 1973 Philadelphia Orchestra tour was not just about music. It exemplified the best in music diplomacy. Music is universal. It transcends linguistic barriers. It speaks for everyone and connects people from diverse backgrounds. The musicians promoted respect, cooperation, and understanding. Both countries benefited from the power of music and cultural exchange to build friendly ties when they had only the lowest level of connection in terms of diplomatic relations. At a time when growing tension marks other aspects of US-China relations, the Philadelphia Orchestra, returning to China regularly over the last 50 years, continues as a crucial diplomatic instrument for improving cooperation and communication between the US and China, finding ways to respect each other despite our differences. Ambassador Nicholas Platt has very much shaped and been a part of this important legacy. And Nick, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Julia. I'm delighted to be here. I'm somewhat mystified and very flattered to be honored for an event that took place 50 years ago. But looking back over my career and so forth, the time that I spent with the orchestra really had staying power, and I agree that it may have been the most significant thing I did, even though I was ambassador to several countries and took part in negotiations, etc. I'm optimistic about the future based on my experience with the Chinese and this program. I feel that Chinese and Americans get along very well together. They have a lot in common. The current leadership is keeping us at arm's length, but that won't last forever. So I look forward to a time when we can do a lot more things than just musical exchange. But for the moment, musical exchange is what we're doing, and we have a wonderful group of people who you're going to meet who are doing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Platt. It is really delightful that you were able to join us tonight and to bring the history alive with your presence. And we, as you said, have 4 really interesting speakers who I'm going to introduce to you in a minute. Just to give you an idea of the way things will flow, we'll hear from each speaker and then we'll have a discussion. And as always, we'll close with questions from the audience. So if you would like to submit a question, and several of you have already submitted in advance, please click on the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen and type it in, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. So let's see, without further ado then, let me first introduce Jennifer Lin, who will be the first speaker, who is the co-director and producer of the acclaimed documentary Beethoven in Beijing. She is also an award-winning journalist and author, and she's working on another documentary, so look out for it. It sounds really interesting. It's going to be about the first Asian to dance for the New York City Ballet. After Jennifer speaks, we will hear from Ryan Fleur, who is executive director of the Philadelphia Orchestra and of the Kimmel Center for the Performing Arts, the largest performing arts organization in Pennsylvania. Ryan is working with the Philadelphia Orchestra as we speak on some very special commemorations, and he'll bring us up to date on what the orchestra's current work with China is and what their plans are for the future. Our last 2 speakers are going to be a husband and wife team, and they are Sheila Melvin and Dr. Jindong Tsai. Between them, they know more about the world of classical music in China than almost anyone I can think of. Sheila is a China analyst and author who writes widely on business and cultural topics. She and her husband Jin Dong have co-authored several books, including Rhapsody in Red, How Western Classical Music Became Chinese, and a book called Beethoven in China, How the Great Composer Became an Icon in the People's Republic. Jin-Dong Tsai, who will speak forth, is both a conductor and a professor of music and arts at Bard College Conservatory of Music. He also directs the U.S.-China Music Institute at Bard. He has conducted major orchestras in both countries and is doing all kinds of interesting things in the world of classical music and U.S.-China relations. So let's get right to it. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you, Madeline. And thank you for organizing this event. And also Ambassador Block, thank you too for putting this all together. Madeline, I was a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer for 31 years. And in the 1990s, I was working in Beijing as a correspondent for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'd gone to China for the first time in 1979 with my father, who had immigrated from Shanghai. And, you know, I'm often asked, you know, why make this film? And I really think that this is a chapter in US-China history that not a lot of people know about or remember. So that really was the prime motivation for making Beethoven in Beijing. A lot of people know about ping pong diplomacy, but not a lot of people really know about music diplomacy. And I would argue that music diplomacy has had a deeper impact on US-China relations. I have kind of a personal interest, kind of a family interest in this topic too, because a cousin of mine in Shanghai was a pianist, and she was at the Shanghai Conservatory as a teenager, and during the Cultural Revolution had her career derailed, like so many people. But in 1973, she was working as a pianist in Shanghai for the Shanghai Lyric Opera Company. And she got a ticket to go hear the Philadelphia Orchestra perform in Shanghai. And she told me later, many years later, that the music was heavenly. And, you know, I'll just never forget that. And when I went with the orchestra in 2008 to cover their tour of China, I was working for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and this was a special tour they were doing because it was the 35th anniversary of the 73 trip. And what I realized was, you know, as I was reporting about this, that there's a whole generation in China, really, that echoed what my cousin said and held like very deep feelings of nostalgia and warmth towards the Philadelphia Orchestra. So I really thought that this is an important story that should be seen and heard and not just read about. So I launched the project in 2015. And the first 4 people I called are literally on this webinar. I called Nick Platt, because he was the man on the ground in 1973 who basically had to hold Eugene Ormandy's hand and escort him around China. I sat down with Ryan Floor. Do you remember Ryan? And I pitched the idea to Ryan because this is Ryan's work. His life work really is global relations for the Philadelphia Orchestra. And of course, I called Sheila and Jin Dong because, as Madeline said, no one knows more about classical music in China than these two. And Jin Dong is actually a producer on the film, and Sheila was one of our advisors. So, you know, I wanted to use the Philadelphia Orchestra really as a character. And the film, if you've watched it, it starts in 73 with the tour, but we go from 73 to the present, or really the story spans a half century. And in some ways, the Philadelphia Orchestra is the only orchestra that could really play this role because they were the first, and they've been back a total of 12 times, which is more than any American orchestra. So we traveled with a crew to China 4 times, 3 times with the Philadelphia Orchestra and once with a group from the Curtis Institute. And we locked our film and finished it on March the 1st, 2020, which was an auspicious time. But the film came out in 2020 in December, and we were happy to see it premiere on PBS Great Performances. So it's been thrilling, and I think really we almost need the messaging of this film now more than ever, because as you know, everyone has pointed out, relations are very tense, and I think we just need to remind ourselves of how culture can connect us. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for bringing the film to life, and thank you also to Sheila and Jindang for the work that you've done between Rhapsody in Red and Beethoven in China, which, particularly for those folks who are interested, have told a really important story and made sure that it's documented. And of course, to Nick for the role that you played back in not only in 1973, but also as serving as a trusted advisor to the Philadelphia Orchestra over the last dozen years. I started at the Philadelphia Orchestra in 2012. My responsibilities go much broader than just the international work, but my first day on the job was in China. With Nick, with the group we were running a pilot program to experiment, and what I was told is you have to see that that the Philadelphia Orchestra's visit in 1973 was the equivalent of what the moonshot was in the U.S. And I didn't believe it, but I've been back probably about 14, 15 times over the last 11 years, and from the taxi drivers to every government official, everybody either knows where they were, where their parents were, where their grandparents were. Okay, that's fine. History is important, but history is only as important as it informs what we do in the future. So over the last dozen years, we have been working. We've taken this brand that we've built, and we've tried to build strategic partnerships. For those of you that have been to China, you know that just about every city, large and small, has built an amazing concert hall over the last 20 years. And that any city, that New York would be proud of, that San Francisco would be proud of. And at the same time, the structures are built, but the art to fill those structures has yet to fully be developed. That's not to say that since 1973, there haven't been an amazing number of artists produced out of China and studying from China, from Tiandun to Jindang, to others that have come about, but also to Lang Lang and to other musicians. But one of the things that we've learned is help, and we've been continually asked to do, is to help some of these orchestras, whether it's the National Center for the Performing Arts Orchestra, the Shenzhen Symphony, the Shanghai Philharmonic, to help them develop a true ensemble sound. Because the type of music, the type of classical musician that has been developed better than probably almost anywhere in the world is this soloist type. So here we are in 2023, 50 years later, and I was making a list of the things that we've done so far this year. And, one of the first things we did in January is we partnered with Yuja Wang. Yuja, was always considered among the top pianists. She did something with us that no one's ever done before, and I don't know whether they will do yet. It's the 150th anniversary of Rachmaninoff's birth, and she, over the course of 2 weekends, played all 5 Rachmaninoff concerti, 4 piano concerti, and the Rhapsody and the theme of Paganini. And then on January 28th, we had a 4.5-hour marathon concert, and she did all 5 at once. So if there's any question who the best pianist in the world is, you can say it's a Chinese pianist or not, it's Yuja. But the point is, I don't know that anybody else other than a Chinese pianist might have been wanted to take that on and improve it, and Yuja fit the bill. But we take very seriously our work in China, and working with the people of China. This year, we did a Lunar New Year concert that we partnered with the city of Suzhou, performing a series of 17 commissions, setting ancient Tang poetry to Western music, but sung in Mandarin by Western singers. And it was really an incredibly moving experience. It came about during the pandemic in Suzhou, and we gave the US premiere of that. Here we are on the actual anniversary to the day. Tomorrow and Thursday, we'll be giving performances at the University of North Carolina, which were the same dates of the final two concerts we gave in 1973 in Beijing. We're here, it's part of a week-long symposia on cultural diplomacy with a focus on the Philadelphia Orchestra's visit. Later next month, about a month from now, the Asia Society will be celebrating our 50th anniversary, in New York City. And then in November, we'll be traveling to Beijing, Suzhou, Tianjin, Shanghai, again, doing events that mark the 50th anniversary, with a highlight being on November 10th, performing side by side with a group that is now known as the China National Symphony, which at the time was known in 1973 as the China Philharmonic. And we'll be collaborating with them. We're only bringing about 20 musicians over with us, but that concert will be it's the official government sanctioned event. The US government will be there, the Chinese government will be there. We are it's very important to us. We take very seriously the democratizing power of music and the power of cultural diplomacy. And what I'll tell you is, we'll often get questioned, well, aren't you worried about the political environment you live in? And to which, what we'll say is, yeah, okay, we can't not do something in China and have it not be political, but we're nonpartisan, we're non-national, and we are bringing nationalistic, and we're all about bringing people together. And I will say, I was in China in July, and it very much, there's a lot of suspicion that exists on a lot of different levels between things happening with the US and China, but there is no suspicion about what's happening with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And I'll close with just giving you just a brief anecdote. When I sat with Ambassador Burns in July, knowing the significance of what we did in 1973, he kind of came and he said, thank you for what you did back then. Our country needed you, the Chinese needed you. It led to the development of official US-China relations, and we need you again now. And so that's where we are right now. We don't know what the future will hold, but we are going to keep doing our work between helping bridge the people of the US and China. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Sheila Melvin.
Great, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here with all my friends and colleagues who have done and are doing so much for the US-China cultural relationship. And I never get tired of talking about the Philadelphia Orchestra and its visit to China. It's just such an important model of collaboration. And as Ambassador Burns said, we really, really do need it now. But I thought I would, for my 3 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever I have, I thought I'd step back a second and put the visit of the Philadelphia Orchestra in a broader context. Because this trip to China in 1973, is of tremendous importance, and its impact is still ongoing. But sometimes it seems like it just came out of thin air, out of the blue, which is not quite true. Because in fact, China was absorbing Western classical music for centuries before the Philadelphia Orchestra visit. When Jindong and I started our book on the history of Western music in China, we put it back in 1601, in fact. But you could even go earlier. And this absorption is part of a broader pattern of cultural absorption, because China excels at taking ideas, arts, philosophies, religion from the outside world, adapting them to its own needs, and then really making them its own. And it's done this with classical music, and in so doing, it has really transformed its own cultural landscape and the lives of many individuals, including that of my husband, who will talk in a few minutes. So to just give you a really quick run through, I mentioned in 1601, an Italian Jesuit polymath named Matteo Ricci, who some people who are watching may know of, traveled to Beijing, and his goal was to convert the emperor to Catholicism. But one of the ways he did it was by bringing unusual gifts from Europe. And one of the gifts he brought was a clavichord, an early keyboard instrument. And China didn't have keyboard instruments, so the emperor was really intrigued by it, and he ordered 4 eunuchs to learn how to play it. So the clavichord was played in the imperial palace in 1601. And this began a tradition of missionaries and then subsequently diplomats bringing Western classical instruments to China and presenting them to the emperor and to key officials. And so this, it didn't really ripple outside the palace, but they were played inside the palace. And they even had an ensemble of about 20 eunuchs who dressed like Europeans with powdered wigs and suits and everything, and played Western classical music. Then when foreigners started settling in China after the Opium War periods in like the late 1800s, mid 1800s, 1879, the first band was founded in Shanghai, the Shanghai Municipal Band, and it soon became an orchestra. And by the 1920s, it was known as the best orchestra in the Far East. And it hosted, world famous musicians like Fritz Kreisler, Jascha Heifetz, Efren Zimbalist. They all went to Shanghai to perform with the Shanghai Orchestra, Symphony Orchestra. In 1927, a very brilliant German-educated Chinese musician named Xiao Youmei created a conservatory in Shanghai. It was called the National Conservatory of Music. Now it's the Shanghai Conservatory. And this became the training ground for the first generation of China's classical musicians. There were many Westerners who taught at the conservatory, including many Jewish people who had to escape either from Russia or later from Europe. And they found safety in Shanghai and they taught music there. Then in 1950, Zhou Enlai decided right after 1949, China was founded. In 1950, Premier Zhou Enlai said, we need a conservatory in Beijing. And so they founded the Central Conservatory at his behest because he believed so strongly in the diplomatic power of classical music and the importance of cultural exchange. In 1959, China actually celebrated the 10th anniversary of the People's Republic of China by performing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. That was one of the celebrations. Beethoven's Ninth with the choral parts sung in Chinese for foreign diplomats. Then the next big highlight is the 1973 visit of the Philadelphia Orchestra to China. And then after that, the Cultural Revolution was still going on, so there was a few years of a lull. But then in 1979, the violinist Isaac Stern visited China to perform and give master classes. And that's also documented in a movie called From Mao to Mozart that some of you may have seen. In the 1980s, China opened its doors and all kinds of Chinese musicians, composers started going outside of China to study. Many really great composers came to the US, to Europe, and musicians as well. And so the doors were open, people were going back and forth. If you go into the 2000s, China joined the WTO, it started to really prosper economically, and then it invested in concert halls, like Ryan mentioned, it started building lots of great concert halls and opera houses. In 2014, the New York Philharmonic established a relationship with the Shanghai Orchestra, Shanghai Symphony, called the Shanghai Orchestra Academy, which, like the Philadelphia Orchestra, is trying to work on sort of collaborative musicianship, people playing an ensemble. 2017, my husband, who we'll talk in a minute, founded a US-China Music Institute at Bard College, which is trying to make music come the other direction into America from China. In 2019, the Juilliard School opened a Tianjin Juilliard branch, which teaches graduate students, again, with a focus on collaborative musicianship. And then if we obviously had the pandemic and exchanges fell to the wayside, but China still had a lot of music being performed during the pandemic. And if you look at it now, in 2015, there were about 35 symphony orchestras in China, and now there are more than 80. So that's in less than 10 years, that many symphony orchestras have been created. To give you one quick example, the city of Wuxi began recruiting for its new symphony in March of this year. They held auditions in Europe, the US, and Singapore in June and July. They started rehearsing in August. They're going to give their first concert in the fall. Then they're going to tour Europe in 2024. And then they're going to move into a brand new concert hall, which is currently under construction in 2025. So this gives you an idea of the speed at which orchestras can be created and set up. There's new opera halls and concert halls are still going up everywhere. I would say now the difference is that conservatories, opera companies, symphonies are building their own concert halls, so they don't have to worry about sharing them with anyone, and students can use them. And these are state-of-the-art facilities. There's lots of music festivals in China now, just like they're all here, and they've become big proponents of contemporary music from China, which is performed alongside the traditional classical repertoire. There's something called the Shanghai Spring International Music Festival, and when they held it in March this year, 40% of the pieces were new works by Chinese composers. The NCPA, the National Center of the Performing Arts, has an opera festival every year, orchestra festival. They did, it's their orchestra, but they do an opera festival. They did 19 new operas from China this year. They had a total of 26 operas, 19 of them were brand new, composed in China. There's also festivals now of Chinese traditional instrument orchestras, because now there's new orchestras growing up that use Chinese instruments, which my husband will talk about also. So I just want to put out a pitch there. I think that China has learned so much from the West, absorbed so much of our music, learned so much from the Philadelphia Orchestra, but I really feel like now there's a lot that we can learn from China, both about managing, expanding, supporting our own classical music institutions and musicians, and also we can start absorbing music from China ourselves so that we can have all the benefits as China has had from our music. And I'll stop there. And introduce my husband, Jindal. Jindal, you're on mute.
Thank you, Sheila. When Sheila just mentioned the Wuxi just created a new symphony orchestra. Actually, last night they contacted me. They said next year is a U.S.-China diplomat relationship, what is it's a big number, right? 45. It's a year. So they said they invite me to do an American music concert there.
Great.
So it's really, you can see this. And since Sheila didn't go through all those landmark years, I think I myself as a conductor and musician actually living through this whole 50 years period. And I think my own musical life is related with this fantastic half century of music making between China and American musicians. So I can start my timeline. And from 1972, when Nixon visited China, I was in the middle school. I was playing the violin, and that year, first time I heard Beethoven symphony in this 78 turntable, and I think it was portrayed in the film. And that year, and when Nixon visited Forbidden City that day, actually, I was selected to be in the Forbidden City to pretend there's not empty Forbidden City, and I was excited to see this American president, but I didn't see him. Anyway, so that's my start of the relationship with America. And then the next year, and the Philadelphia Orchestra came to China. I was still young in the middle school and kind of a performing art high school, but I just so energized to see, wow, look at this, there's a real American symphony orchestra came to perform in China. So that's it's the beginning. Then after that, after the Cultural Revolution, and there are more orchestras start to come to China. And I remember the most is 1979, when that year when the Boston Symphony came with C.J. Ozawa, and Karajan came with the Berlin Philharmonic, and I was a freshman in college, so I didn't miss any single rehearsals and performances, and I was masterminded by these conductors. As say, C.J. Ozawa is move every part of his body to give this kind of a exciting gesture to the musicians, and the orchestra sounds came out just fantastic. And on the other hand, Karajan conduct with his eye closed. He's even barely move, but the sound come out also is fantastic. So that made me want to be a conductor. And then I want to be conductor. I decided if I want to be conductor, I want to come to the West to study. So that's how I came in 1985 and to the New England Conservatory to study conducting. I was the first conducting student from China ever admitted. So from there on, I really started my conducting career. In 1979, I started in Tanglewood with Lerna Bernstein, and and then from there on, I start to start my professional career in America. But same time, I always wanted to go back to China to help China what I have learned in America, and to strengthen this relationship. Even when I was in New England Conservatory, I arranged our course, went to China to perform, and then from there on, I've been doing concert basically, and really never stopped. And like in 1999, I produced 2 programs in Shanghai, introduced symphonic music from America, including Gershwin, Copland, and John Corgliano, and John Williams, all those American symphonic music. And in that occasion, actually, I met Sheila in Shanghai for the first time. So then this cultural exchange, I think, was in the golden days between America and China. In 2008, I took the Stanford Symphony course, and we have like 300 people visit China to be part of the Beijing Olympic Music Festival. And we performed with Tsinghua, Beida, Central Conservatory student in the Great Hall people. We did Beethoven 9. So all my experience actually is related with the connections between U.S.-China music relationship. And so it's a really, I think, what we should continue. And, when we talk about it today, there's a political obstacles, but at the same time, I really share the same optimistic with Ambassador Platt. There's so many people and so many American musicians, so many Chinese musicians. We want to make music together. And through those 50 years, I will say hundreds of thousands of Chinese musicians went overseas to learn Western music, and then some went back to China, some stayed in the West, and those people will continue to have the effort to strengthen the relationship. And in 2017, and with Bard College support, we created this U.S.-China Music Institute, and it's the first conservatory in the West. We have a Chinese instrument major, so you can get the undergraduate degree and graduate degree in Chinese music instrument performances. So we listed, erhu player, pipa player, the same level as violin, cello, and bass. And I think this is also very important, and the communication go both ways. And we created the U.S. and the China Now Music Festival in New York City. And this year will be the 6th annual, and to introduce music from contemporary China. And I still come back between China and America to do concerts and to give lectures and to do everything I can in my power to push to continue to have the people's relationship. When I was in 2016, I think that I went to China with the Philadelphia Orchestra to visit. That time, we organized a party for the old Philadelphia Orchestra musicians and Chinese Philharmonic musicians. We had that party. And the oboe player, he showed us an oboe reed. When the Philadelphia Orchestra visited China, and the principal gave to him. That's in 1973, and until 1916, he's still holding that. I think it's a treasure, and that you can show between China and America, between musicians, between people, will continue to have the thriving relationship. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. Those were really wonderful to set the stage. And is everybody back now on the screen? Okay, good. So let's just kick off with, I actually have a question I would like to ask Ambassador Platt, if you can hear me. The question came from someone in the audience, and I think you're the best person to answer this. They said, what were the sort of political machinations behind the scene before the orchestra came? We know that Madame Mao famously came to one of the orchestra concerts. Were any of the other PRC leadership supportive or not supportive publicly?
No, when Madame Mao came, there was a special sort of leadership concert, and all of the leaders came with her. So it was quite a turnout. Madame Mao, of course, was a fierce person, and when she decided that she wanted to have Beethoven's Sixth, and Ormandy said, "I don't really like that symphony," I figured I was in trouble. But I went to Shanghai to meet the orchestra, to get to know Ormandy. I said to Ormandy, "You we have a highest level request for Beethoven 6. He said, I hate that symphony. I said, well, let me tell you what it means to them. And of course, I was making this up. And in diplomacy, you have to make things up sometimes. But basically, I said, they identify this with their own peasant revolution. Anyway, so we had to negotiate every single piece, and so there was an awful lot of tension and difficulty behind the scenes. But when the orchestra arrived, everything fell into place.
Madeline, I want to add a postscript to Nick's story, if I may. And Nick, you haven't heard this yet, but when I was in China in July, you were making plans for November, and there's a lot of official government entities involved. It's all very complicated. And there's this big event we're doing, this side-by-side event with the China National Symphony, and we're sitting with the cultural ministry and we're talking about the repertoire. And they say, well, what would you like to play? And we go through, and we say we want to play Beethoven 6. Would you think it's a natural piece to play? And we go through the rest of the program, and they sit there and they nod. And they said, well, what about Beethoven 5? And I said, well, wait a minute. And I told Nick's story, but I didn't tell the part about making it up. I said, it's the real thing. And because that story works in China. They said, and the next day we went with the China National Symphony. They said, well, I think you should do Beethoven 5. And the reason was they don't want to do anything that may have any tie to Madame Mao around an anniversary. So 50 years later, it's come full circle. So
well, the Beethoven 5 was kind of forbidden to do during the visit, right? But actually, Ormandy did it in the rehearsal. When Ormandy and some player visit the Central Philharmonic, and Li Dolun, the conductor, actually did the first movement of the Beethoven Fifth. Then they gave the baton to Ormandy to say, the maestro, can you do this? Then he took over. So that's actually, yeah.
And Madeline, I just wanted to add something, and Sheila, you can jump in on this too. But the whole concept of music diplomacy was really championed by Zhou Enlai. And there's something, I wrote a book based on the 1973 tour also. It's an oral history. And one of the things in the book, but it's not in the movie, is that after the Philadelphia Orchestra left China in January of 1974, there was a crackdown on Beethoven that was announced in the newspapers. So there was some sort of behind the scenes tug of war going on between Zhou Enlai and Madame Mao. So opinions vary on who was behind this new crackdown on Beethoven. Was it Madame Mao trying to get after Zhou Enlai, or was it Zhou Enlai going after Madame Mao? Who knows? But it's just even after the visit, Western classical music was still used, as a political tool. Sheila, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, it's a debate between absolute music and programmatic music.
Mhm.
Yeah, because the Chinese tradition is like every piece of music has to have a title, have to refer to the mountain or river or people's mood. But then Beethoven is only, E flat major piano concerto or C major symphony. So that was a debate, but behind the debate definitely is a political struggle between Madame Mao and Zhou Enlai.
Right. And the whole debate is that, every music has meaning, it has content. And if you take a little further, every composer class background is reflected in the music.
Yeah.
So you can't just say it's a numbered symphony and it has no particular meaning. Actually, it does have meaning, and the meaning has to come partly from the class background of the composer. So prior to the visit, my understanding is that Premier Zhou was studying all the symphonies of Beethoven, because when Kissinger made his secret visit there, he had the orchestra perform a Beethoven symphony for Kissinger. And he wanted to learn it because he said, he's German, we should play Beethoven. And so then he himself personally studied the Beethoven symphonies to learn about them. And then Madame Mao also learned about them too. And this Fifth Symphony was said to be about fatalism. And that's why they didn't want the Fifth Symphony then, because you don't have fatalism in a socialist country, because everything's going to get brighter all the time. So you don't be fatalistic. And the Third Symphony had also been considered, but Beethoven had originally dedicated that to Napoleon, even though he crossed it out, and we didn't want to have something about Napoleon. So then we're sort of going through the symphonies, and Li Delun, the conductor, thought about that. He also said, oh, it's about countryside, so to make it. And then Ambassador Platt followed up on that too in his own thinking. So that's sort of this whole argument. But the whole idea is that music does have inherent meaning, and the composer's class background is reflected through the music.
I'm so glad you said that, because I was just about to ask what was the problem with Beethoven's Fifth, but that makes good sense. What is it about Beethoven that captures the Chinese imagination so much? You wrote a whole book about Beethoven. Is he a greater icon than other composers in China now?
Yeah, he is an unparalleled composer in China. And he was introduced to China in 1905. And no one heard his music in China. It was introduced as a humanity figure, because China was really in a very bad shape, in the end of the Qing dynasty. And they even abandoned the Confucius exam in the nation. So the young people lost hope in the country. So they started to look at Europe, and they started to look at the West. So what can save China? And then Beethoven would bring it in and to introduce China as a humanity figure, and say, Li Shutong, this young person studied in Japan, and bring the Beethoven back to China to say, I said to say, Beethoven, it's a whole Europe is really think this is a hero, and he cannot hear, and he came in from very his father beating him, and his nephew mistreated him, and he cannot hear any music, but he create great music. Everyone love it. So China in that time needs hero like that. And China always say, even when I grew up, to say you have to go through hardship, become triumphed. And so like you have to eat the bitter, it's called 吃苦. And so Beethoven fit in that character. And I think that's why Beethoven start to have that kind of a very special symbol to the Chinese people.
Ah, that makes sense.
Let me just add a point about the negotiations. These are dealt with in more detail in my memoir called China Boys. And I recommend people to take a look at that if they're interested in more detail on the background, the negotiations, and the actual trip itself. Thanks.
Yeah, I recommend it too. I recently read it before this event, and it had great background on the early days of the liaison office and Nixon's visit, and then this 70s. But I actually have a question about Nixon. So in the movie, it shows Nixon calling Eugene Ormandy to say he was invited. What was Nixon's role? How did he get involved in all this?
Well, Nixon, it was after 1 year after his trip to China in 72. And, there was a lot of interest in cultural diplomacy, and he wanted to send an orchestra because it's such an expression of, artistic majesty. And Nixon had a sweet spot for Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra in general. Nixon was I believe a pianist, and enjoyed classical music. And when he was growing up, would listen to the albums of the Philadelphia Orchestra. And Eugene Ormandy in 1970 received a presidential medal from Nixon. And Ormandy was a very politically astute conductor, and he lobbied hard to go to China. He approached a lot of his political friends in Philadelphia, and they lobbied on his behalf. So when it came time to inviting an orchestra, it almost had to be the Philadelphia Orchestra. It was Nixon's favorite. And in China, they had a soft spot for the Philadelphia Orchestra also because in 1940, the Philadelphia Orchestra held a benefit concert for China. This was to raise funds for medical relief. And Ryan, I see you agitating.
No, I just want to say there is one other. Ormandy was politically savvy. What he also did is he offered the Philadelphia Orchestra to play for Nixon's second inauguration,
yes,
which was January 1973, knowing the time.
Yeah, and that was, and Nixon selected the Philadelphia Orchestra over the National Symphony because it was a very politically fraught time in the United States over the Vietnam War. And some orchestras didn't want to play for Nixon's inauguration. So there was some backlash in Philadelphia over that decision.
So much politics around these concerts and these relationships that I didn't realize.
There's no such thing as art without politics. Chairman Mao said it. It's true. It's true.
So speaking of art and politics, so we all know that there's a certain amount of political and cultural tightening in China right now, and some suspicion of foreign forces and Western influence. So I guess I'm wondering, has this affected Chinese people's appreciation of the Western musical canon at all, or is music somehow exempt?
Let me just say this. The Philadelphia Orchestra in China is a household word. I remember visiting China several years afterwards, and the taxi driver asked me what I was representing, and I said Philadelphia. Oh, he said, "You mean the orchestra?"
Wow.
Mhm.
So the Philadelphia Orchestra may be exempt, but is there any slowdown in appreciation? And
I don't think so. I mean, I think that there's an expansion of appreciation for music created in China, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a natural development. It's an outcome of all these years of exchanges. And there's lots of fantastic Chinese musicians and composers who are composing music, and their pieces are being played. And sometimes it's with government funding, like maybe there's more of an emphasis on. But, I see that as a good thing. There's plenty of Western and American music being performed. The president of Bard College, Liam Botstein, was in Shanghai in June conducting American music with the Shanghai Symphony. I mean, as soon as exchanges could open up again, they opened up again. There's Tianjin Juilliard doing festivals. It's the only limiting factor right now is, as we were speaking before we started officially, Ryan was saying how, air travel is still very expensive. It's still very limited. It's still hard to get back and forth to China. I would say that's the real limiting factor. The music is being performed and it's very warmly welcomed, and the halls are filled when it's played.
Yeah, I would say in terms of repertoire, and there's a little switch, and it's not less classical masterpiece has been performed, but there are more the government and encourage a composer to write more new music. So that's had been like that. For example, Gong Peng Peng, who really collaborated with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and he went to Juilliard, and he went back to China because the Shanghai Philharmonic hired him as a resident composer. And since he went back, and now he already composed 12 symphonies, and it's an all huge, like 1 hour long symphony. Every piece of music he write get performed, and some of them get performed a lot. So you can see many for Chinese composers, they think this is the symphony orchestra or the opera become an artistic format. It's just become for them to compose something new music. So I think, but classical music is still very proud to perform in many of those most of the orchestras.
What about Juilliard? There's so few U.S.-China, joint schools, and to have Juilliard be there and being successful, how did that relationship happen?
Who wants to jump in?
Yeah.
I think
Doesn't every music school in America want to have a branch in China?
Well, it's a major undertaking to establish a branch in China. It's a very expensive undertaking, and Juilliard, has this tremendous reputation, and China likes places with tremendous reputation. So I think it was kind of a natural fit. And former the President Polisi, I think, worked really, really very hard to get this relationship. And there was high level support in the Chinese leadership too, because people in the leadership who care about arts and cultures. So I think it had a lot of very positive political background on both sides. And they just went for it and set it up.
Yeah.
And is it working out well?
I think so far so good. They only have a graduate level orchestra studies, which is creating an orchestra for master degree program and pre-college program. They don't have an undergraduate program there. I think the strategy is they don't want to compete undergraduate with the New York Juilliard. And I think last year, they had the first graduate level students, and many of those actually become part of this big orchestra booming. Become orchestra players around Chinese orchestras. And this past summer, they did the first piano festival after the COVID, and it was really widely promoted and quite successful.
Right. I think the pandemic was a little hard because they draw students from around Asia and the world. It's not just for students in China, but obviously that couldn't happen during the pandemic. But now I think it's, able to recruit more broadly again.
That's right.
So back to the Philadelphia Orchestra just for a minute. Ryan, I wondered if you could comment at all on how performing in China has changed the financial picture for some Western orchestras. What's the, apparently, there was a time when the Philadelphia Orchestra was struggling and the relationship with China was very positive. And what is the financial sort of impact of China's interest in orchestra?
Well, listen, anything you do in China is essentially transactional, no matter what the passion is and no matter what where the work lies. This is not working in classical music in China is a little bit different than, say, the NBA in China, which is that's purely a commercial venture. When the orchestra was dealing with some issues about a dozen years ago, what we were looking to do was broaden beyond Philadelphia, and China was a very viable option at the time, and we've been able to maintain those relationships. So there's a value for what we do, and but essentially, what we're doing in China is mission based, and we're going back there because we see the audiences, we see the young children in the concert halls that are coming. And, we're frankly, when Sheila talks about wanting to learn from the Chinese, I mean, we'd love to recreate that sort of demographic at some of the concerts we give in Philadelphia.
So speaking of mission-based, the orchestra, when it goes to China or tours other countries, you're doing a lot more than just giving concerts, am I right?
Yes, that's right. Our model is, yes, we give the concerts, with the full orchestra is what we're known for. But we try very hard to be doing, whether it's master classes or working side by side with other professional musicians, sometimes younger musicians. Sometimes it's about doing something symbolic, going to an iconic location where we're traveling and having a quartet of musicians give a pop-up concert. Those are things that work. We've learned over time, and because we get approached a lot, particularly from various cities or groups in China, that we can do those sorts of surface level things, or we can do sort of deeper deeper learning type moments. And we're really trying to drill down on the deeper learning moments with some of our partners now.
Yeah, I think they're really in the new era, right? After COVID, I think from both sides, we can work together among musicians and music leaders to create something even more interesting. There are several areas I feel we could work together. First, I will say new music. And there's so many new music have been composed among the Chinese composers and Asian composers in general. But in the West, we are still mostly dominated by classical music, from 19th and 20th, even early 20th century. So we need to have our American orchestra to perform more contemporary music. Those music in China, not necessarily what we call the contemporary music, people don't keep away from it. And the music like a Peng Peng or some other composers from in China actually is quite well received by the audience. And why is that? So we have to see how they did that, why we cannot do that. And I think that is a very important mission for all classical music musicians to find the music voice of our time. And if you go back to Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, even Beethoven, they play their contemporary composer music. But now we do mostly it's the classical music. So that's what I think we could work together. And I know there's some orchestra started doing like that. And some of the major orchestra, like Philadelphia Orchestra, has started to have a Chinese New Year concert, right? And every year. And so it's already starting. I think it's something we could together. But what I think Philadelphia Orchestra, the Chinese New Year's concert, really brilliant because they bring some really interesting music. And some orchestra, American orchestra, want to do Chinese New Year concert, but struggling to find the right music. So that it can be communication between the musicians, between the organizations, then we can do more. And another important area, it's just like Ryan just mentioned, music education. And music education to educate in this country, and when you go to China to share this kind of music passion, music education with the Chinese people, I think that's also important. If we don't have music education, and the young people cannot have that opportunity to learn the classical music or contemporary classical music, and then we don't have future of audience. So that's what I think also we can work together. Of course, and then the third area, I would say, between musicians, we should, share ideas and perform in different countries, in either other countries to continue this cultural, person to person, this cultural music cultural exchange.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's very important. And what is the big up and coming orchestras in China? When we see lists of the best orchestras in the world, we're still seeing European and American orchestras. When will we be seeing Chinese orchestras, and what should we look for? That's for you, Jin Dong, I think.
Well, I think most of Chinese people still admire those, orchestras from Philadelphia to New York to Berlin or Vienna, because that's the Western tradition. And just like Western people look at the Peking opera, right? It's the same way. It's the Chinese tradition. So definitely the traditionally deep rooted in the West, it's still the best. And I think that's many Chinese orchestras are actually willing to learn, just like Ryan said. So we need to provide the opportunity for them to learn. And but at the same time, I still go back to this way, is we need to have I think to measure orchestra is one thing about which one is better. But I think the most important is a composition. What is our time of the composition? How this music can connect people together, not just the Mahler, Tchaikovsky, and Beethoven, but it's a new concept or new thing, new thinking. And in 2019, we commissioned Zhou Long, the U.S.-China Music Institute and Stanford. We commissioned Zhou Long to write it's a symphonic cantata called The Mans of Iron and the Golden Spike. Basically, it's reflecting Chinese railroad workers came to America to help Americans to build East-West Continental Railroad. So this cantata is 1 hour long with chorus, solos, and the orchestra, and we perform in Carnegie Hall. And we bring the orchestra to Stanford to perform. And really, it's one of the things I think we can find a common ground and common theme to use music as a tool to explore that kind of a culture. And the theme, it's my friend at Stanford, he's a history professor. He's been researching this Chinese railroad workers for decades. And he said, Jindong, and I'm frustrated because so little people know about this. There's only one line in the school textbook. What do you think we can do to bring it on stage? So I think you can see that's what we did. It's a music's function and how music can just bring the spirit to the people.
Is that Professor Chang, Gordon Chang?
Yes.
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 So he did a talk for us about the history of the railroad workers, and we're thinking of actually doing another program about that. So I'm really interested.
Yeah, so he and I just talk about what are we going to do. So we talk about the opera. And then I just say opera is so expensive to produce. We want to make a work that can be easier to be performed. So then in the end, we settled this cantata because China has this Yellow River cantata, right? Very famous, and it's easy to produce, and of course can sing. It's very inspirational. So we did that. Then we find Su Wei is my friend, teach at Yale, write the lyrics. And then Zhou Long, in the beginning, Zhou Long didn't really want to do because it was so busy to compose other pieces. Then I took him to the Sierra Mountain. We dropped there to look at this railroads, and he just feels so moved. He said, "I have to write this," and then we made it happen. And 2019 we did. Then we already planned to in April 2020 to have a China tour, but then COVID happened, so we didn't realize that.
I think it's important to add that the Philadelphia Orchestra has been teaching Chinese orchestras what it takes to tour in America. The contacts, the travel, the expenses, and so forth. And several orchestras have already visited under Philadelphia's auspices.
Right. And to go back to your original question about the top orchestras in the world, I mean, I don't think you're going to find too many people comparing, there's the Philadelphia Orchestra, the Berlin, there's New York, the world's great orchestras. They've been the world's great orchestras for a century. It's kind of hard to get into the ranks of them, but it also says who makes the list and what categories, what do you put on the list to get there? And if you look at Chinese orchestras, like we were talking before, what about performing the most new music? What about getting the most young people into the concert halls? What about the most adventurous approach to this? Using the internet most effectively, using social media, there's all kinds of things that Chinese orchestras are doing really well. And, Maestro Yu Long has been conducting the Shanghai Symphony and the China Philharmonic. He's done all kinds of amazing things. And there's lots of good new younger conductors coming up too. So I think we will see lots of really, maybe they'll be making the list one of these days if the list makers open their eyes and see China as part of the classical music world instead of shoving over an ethnomusicology, which is where it's still generally put.
Interesting. That's a good point. We could keep talking, but I think we should turn to some of these audience questions. And one of them flows directly out of this discussion, and it's, what about university collaborations? This question comes from Jim Cooney in Colorado, Fort Collins. Colorado State University and its student orchestra, for example, are working closely with East China Normal University. So Jindong, your university is obviously doing a lot, but is this widespread? Are other American universities collaborating in music with China?
We our program is a really collaboration with the Central Conservatory of Music. So especially the Chinese instrument program, our students all taught by a professor from the Central Conservatory, both online and in person. So that's is our relationship. Definitely, I think there's in China, just like before the COVID, Chinese universities willing to collaborate with American colleges and universities, that including music schools. I think there's still lots going on. American professors in the conservatories and composers and want to continue to connect with China. And for many American conservatories, also one of the major sources to recruit is from China. And so that's definitely making another layers of this communication. And like I'm going back to China in end of October to early November to recruit students, and including Western musicians and Chinese instrument musicians. So I hope I'm sure both sides of the university level would like to continue to communicate to strengthen the cultural exchange.
I remember
I think there's I'm sorry, go
ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think I know we get approached by a lot more groups than we are able to partner with. And what happens is, it's like you said, Jin Dong, you work at the Central Conservatory, so we might work with the China Conservatory. It's hard because you have the biggest conservatories will sort of have the loudest voices and you bring the most, bring the most talent, et cetera. So if there was a way, I know certainly if there were a way to connect more U.S. musical groups with Chinese musical entities, there would be a whole lot more. But I don't know that anybody's really thought deeply about how to make those connections.
I remember I worked at George Mason University for quite a long time, and the dean of the College of Visual and Performing Arts was very excited, made several trips to China, and started a Master of Arts Management program at George Mason that was very soon became very popular with Chinese students, and every year more and more. So I don't know exactly now what the status is, but arts management was viewed as a really important aspect for China to develop at that time, and they were sending a lot of people here. I have another question here from the audience. It's kind of an interesting one from an anonymous. Does anyone based in China play a Stradivarius? And are there any other priceless instruments in China that people own?
I'm going to guess most of the priceless instruments in the world are in China now, or at least many of them. Jindo?
Right?
Yeah, there's most of those very active soloists in China. I would say many of them play Stradivarius or Guarneri or those famous instruments, and some of them purchased by Chinese, and it's on their collection. They lend out to the musicians. And some of them actually from the West, like a Stradivarius Foundation, they lend this instrument to musicians for them to play. So the format is they get the instruments and they pay the insurance, but they get played for free, right? And so that's the kind of a format, because all those valuable instruments had to be played. Otherwise, you cannot just put it away, and then will really not good for the instrument itself.
Were there, during the Cultural Revolution, some places in China were destroying Western instruments, is that right? Or were people allowed to play certain kinds of music and not other kinds?
Yeah, it happened in the period, for example, especially from 1966 to 1969. So that's a hard, the beginning, a couple of years of the Cultural Revolution, and everything Western, everything old was forbidden. So that including destroy the conservatory facilities, destroy piano, and I'm sure there's some string instruments also been destroyed. But, and so does even people, in the 3 years period, the Shanghai Conservatory, there's 17 professors committed suicide. And so this is really, it's a history happened during that time. And, but, that really never stopped China from level classical music.
Right. And also it's important to add that, some of the instruments were destroyed and many people were destroyed and suffered terribly in the first few years. But then after that, Western musical instruments were introduced into the so-called model operas that Madame Mao promoted. And they became a very important part of the political music that was played through the rest of the Cultural Revolution. And many, many people learned, including Jin Dong, he learned how to play Western instruments when they were performing model operas. So it was not at all her intention. But what happened after the Cultural Revolution ended is all these people had been exposed to these Western musical instruments through these political model operas, and they were interested in them and they wanted to learn how to play them. And then they started playing Western music on these Western instruments. So the Cultural Revolution actually helped to propagate Western instruments all around the country, including even the piano. There were piano model operas.
Yeah.
Too. And violins were in all the model operas, Chinese instruments mixed together with Western instruments, because Madame Mao thought that Western instruments had a bigger sound and were more powerful and could better inspire people to revolution.
That's right. There's a Chinese orchestra, which means the orchestra created all with Chinese instrument. And that Chinese, like 100 people, just like a symphony orchestra. And that Chinese orchestra actually modeled after Western symphony orchestra. And so they add strings, they have string section, they have a plugging instrument section, and they have a wind instrument section and percussion section. It just, it's they're learning from Western classical music and to create their own. So that was, it's also good. And in the past decade, I would say China is a big manufacturing base for, China produce, I would say nearly 80% of piano every year in the world. They don't produce Steinway, they don't produce those high-end instrument, but they basically from the low until the 80% that China produce them. And the string instrument, millions of instruments, and they produce. And then many of those European violin makers actually buy those rod violin from China, then they remake them because they need the material and so on. So a lot of those things, and you can see, and because of that base, that's the population, and the classical music actually still really rather vibrant in China. I met some years ago, I met a bass maker in a village. So he showed me this storage room. There's literally 1,000 basses. He said, I can ship bass to anywhere in the world, and tomorrow. So if anyone need it, so I will ship it. So you can see the volume in China in the music instrument making and the orchestra creating, opera creating. It's still quite huge.
Guitar, most practice instruments come from China now. I would say piano. Many people have. They might still have a brand that's a European brand name, but the pianos are actually made in China.
Right. Exactly.
Back in 2017, and Jennifer, your team might have been there. Filming it. We went to a violin factory. We brought some musicians there, and they were making student violins. In the U.S., it was carried under the Eastman brand, and it was a very touching moment where. We went, the musicians got a tour of the factory, and they're walking around and sawdust everywhere. And then they played. And what happened was we played for the workers and their kids who lived there at this factory. And many of them had never heard the instruments played before. Wow. They just were there for because it's all in the cities where people are learning.
That's right. Yeah.
That actually was one of the questions from the audience that I was going to ask you, which was, is China becoming a maker of world-class stringed instruments? And it sounds like they're making good instruments, if not world-class at this point.
Yeah, there are very few what do you call instrument masters, and in the Central Conservatory and the couple in Shanghai, people start to reserve violin or cello from them. But I think mostly for not high end, but the medium and lower end, mostly used for education, music education, school orchestras, and so on. It's and I just like what I mentioned, it's a interesting phenomenon. If you go to a violin shop, there's like a 500 violin hanging there. Then you say, I want to buy a violin. Then you say, okay, how much money you want to pay? So you say, I want to pay $1,000. Then they will bring 5 violins for you to choose. And if you say, I want to spend $5,000, then we'll bring 20 violins for you to choose. It's it's a basic, the selections like that way. And every year there's an instrument fair. It's just like I think we have that too. It's hundreds of vendors together in Beijing and in Shanghai. It's a huge fair. It's unbelievable. And there's like a line of a whole valley is like a bassoon maker, and it's really, to look at it, it's just fantastic.
So we're getting close to the time, and I want you all to think about whether there's anything you'd like to close with about this special anniversary. And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to ask one final audience question, because it's a good note to close on, from Lin Nan Tang. What is the true cultural impact on average citizens of the visit of the orchestra on the China, instead of the impact on Chinese elites and musical professionals? So when the orchestra goes and plays in China, do you feel like you're having an impact on average citizens? Ryan?
Yeah, I'm thinking about, usually when we're going, many of our concerts are broadcast, and I don't know what the equivalent of Nielsen ratings are. What we're told, that 100 million people watched a broadcast, or 20 million people watched it. And I remember we did one of these broadcasts once, and the Grammys were happening in the U.S. and I remember the worldwide attendance, for people watching the Grammys was 15 million people. And I said, well, I guess we're reaching more people, but I don't know. I will say there were times when we worked with groups. We went to, for example, the Sun Chenling Center, which is, or when we've gone back to the Shanghai Children's Palace, where there are 40,000 students a year that are touched. And I mean, and we see the faces. I'm not in China enough to know whether all the kids that we're working with are only exclusively elite families or more broadly speaking. But I have to believe some of the facts of the number of Chinese that have been lifted out of poverty, that there's some impact that we're having beyond just folks that might be part of the elite families.
There's the elite level, definitely. Some of my friends, it's like what do you call 发烧友 or hard classical music lovers. They can identify every Furtwängler's performance of Brahms, or they can identify all those. That definitely there's a level of sophistication. But I think in general, Chinese people listen to classical music has less boundary. They think about Beethoven, Mahler, or Gershwin, John Williams, not that much different. They're all Western music. And so they also enjoy Chinese music to be played by the symphony orchestra. They more look at this like a medium for them for to enjoy the music. I think that for majority of the Chinese audience is in that kind of state, and of course this is also what I always say, for those audience, and I think the classical music is really what do you call it? It's between deep philosophical and idea and entertainment. So it's between. So it's not really completely looking search for soul from Mahler symphony, but actually enjoy this sound or entertainment. So that's, I think, is a combination in Chinese society, and the classical music, deeply rooted, but is not completely.
The questioner was also asking about the visit in 73. And I think while the people in the audiences for those 6 programs were the Chinese elite and professional musicians, I do think it had a broader impact generally, because it was part of this effort of cultural diplomacy to change perceptions of Americans. And you have to remember that anyone born after 49 grew up with the idea that America was the American wolves. I mean, that's how they refer to us. And Jindong, you talk about that in the film, that you were kind of surprised when you heard as a teenager that the Philadelphia Orchestra was coming, because you had grown up with this idea of the Americans were the enemy. So it wasn't just in 73, it was the Philadelphia Orchestra, but there was a string of other groups that came over. There were American college swimmers and American basketball players and other types of cultural groups. So it was part of a broad effort to change perception. So when the Philadelphia Orchestra is on the front page of the People's Daily, the average person does notice that. And so there was an impact beyond just those elites who got to hear the music. And in the film, we focus a lot on Tan Dun. And, he's a great example of someone who only heard fragments of the music, what was going on over the loudspeaker, not a whole concert. But even that little moment had an impact on him. So I do think there was broad impact from the visit.
I thought that was actually a very moving part of the film, was when Tan Dun talked about hearing over the loudspeaker about some of the snippets of the orchestra and how that changed his life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Clearly.
we all had that feeling. We definitely.
Well, that's exactly the note I was wanting to close on, was just returning to the original event and its impact, and just let anybody else have a moment to make any closing remarks if you'd like.
Well, somebody put a question in there that I'll answer. I had a blank check, and I presume it's around China, U.S.-China relations. What would I spend it on for the Philadelphia Orchestra? I would pick an inland city, Chengdu, Xi'an, Wuhan, and enter into some deep partnership with both the professional orchestra that's building up and the conservatory, where our musicians could go out and regularly work and have some commissioning, et cetera, and be able to dig deep in. Because when we go to China, what happens again, overwhelmingly, there's so much pressure to do things in Beijing and Shanghai that we don't get nearly enough time into some of the inland cities that have the population is just as dense.
And the appreciation is just as strong, probably.
Right.
Good. Thank you. Thank you all. And that reminds me, what I'd like to say in closing is something that I noticed Ambassador Platt's book, China Boys. It reminds me of something you said in that book, that U.S.-China relations can be like the weather. They vary greatly depending on the atmosphere. When you're up in the higher reaches of the atmosphere, it can be very cold and frosty, but down on closer to the earth, things are warmer and they're more vibrant. And this discussion reminds me of that the relationships among the people and the musical exchanges are very important. They're very strong. There's a great affinity between musicians in our two countries. And because our relations at the top may be tense, doesn't necessarily mean that these other events aren't important and aren't going to continue. So thank you all very much tonight. This was very special. And if anybody's in the Chapel Hill area, you can hear the Philadelphia Orchestra do a concert the next 2 nights, ending with the Beethoven's 6th Symphony in honor of the centerpiece of the concerts in China. So good night, everybody, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.